Hello and welcome to the Outcomes Over Hours show. I'm super excited for our guest today, who is Hugo Contente. And Hugo is the Vice President of People and Talent at Torrens University, which is Australia's fastest growing university. They also have corporate partnerships with some of the biggest brands on the planet, names such as Vogue, Four Seasons, Hilton and PlayStation, to name a few. Hugo has deep expertise in talent development and in training. So welcome to the Outcomes Over Our show, Hugo.
Thank you so much, Tina. Glad to be here. How are you?
I'm very well. Now, it was interesting. Before we started recording, you mentioned that you did your thesis 20 years ago on burnout, which is a topic that a lot of corporate leaders are struggling with right now. Can you share a little bit about what you learned that might be interesting for people to know?
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's a bit telling about my age. It was slightly more than 20 years now. So it's been quite a long time. But yeah, I think that at the time, my focus was predominantly around coping mechanisms and coping strategies that people would use to deal with potentially extreme situations that could lead to that burnout. The kind of top of mind, the things that for me stood out at the time was that there was not a one size fits all approach, depending on what you did and the environments that you were. The techniques that people would use would vary a lot. At the time, we had to do an applied study, so I did that with doctors working in the ER, and how they dealt with things like, for instance, death, and as you can imagine, situations that can take you to the extreme. And it was exactly that. First and foremost, the importance for everyone to be aware of the exposure that they have in such situations, and with that awareness, to really work on developing their own coping strategies to ensure that they literally did not burn out.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And I think you're ahead of your time, because one of the things I talk about a lot in my Outcomes Over Hours program is often strategies are not a one size fits all. And I think a lot of people say, here's a blanket thing that will work. And as we know, that's not necessarily the case.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And once again, depending on the environment that you operate, even depending on yourself, your own personality, your own style. I remember realizing and seeing being applied in real context a few strategies that for me were almost shocking because they just did not resonate with me as an individual. But when talking with a person, understanding her own or his own style, the context where they're operating, it made all sense. So very important learning very early in my career, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that learning that you had also, that one size does not fit all, that's really relevant for leaders today in a hybrid work context. Because I think we know, and I hear it all the time, that some people love a commute into the office where they say, that's me time, I get to disconnect, while others go, it's dead time, I really don't like it. And so that approach that you mentioned actually goes into other areas as well. And I guess on that, I'd love your views on what are the couple of skills that you see that you think that leaders should be focusing on right now as they think about hybrid work and the future of work and how they can be really effective leading their teams going forward.
Yeah. I think there's several things there that kind of intersect each other, but just trying to distill a few. And I think that will relate a lot with even the motto for your show, right? The first one is clearly a much bigger focus on results or outcomes in terms of action. Yeah. Working remotely completely changes the game in terms of the way you are able to follow up a company, what your team is doing. And for those that are still trying to apply their old style while working online, it's just not going to work. So for some people, this might be challenging because it does require you to change your paradigm, change your approach, but to be much more focused around the outcome, the expectations that you set for your team. And that requires by default that you need to be much more clear right from the get-go around what are your expectations in all dynamics. And then just allow that people will work on that and hopefully, if all goes well, deliver upon those results. and the way they do it, where they do it, when they do it, except that that might not be exactly as it was before. It might not be exactly as you would expect, but as long as the outcome is there, just accept it and embrace it. So I think that's one important thing. A second thing that I have been kind of valuing a lot more recently, even, is what I've been calling intentionality on the relation. What do I mean by intentionality? Uh, I recall when pre-COVID, I would work with my team and we were on a big open space. The amount of interaction, normal, casual, non-planned interaction I would have with either my direct colleagues, HR team, or any of the teams was much bigger. Just the mere fact of walking to go out to have lunch or just walking to go to the toilet, I would meet a lot of people and would greet a lot of people, and normal, casual conversation would engage. And probably at the time, we did not even realize how, though, that small talk often would be then important for you to establish and reinforce relations. When you move into a virtual space, when I go to have lunch, when I go to the toilet, I don't meet anyone on the way because I'm between my home office and my kitchen or my bathroom. That means that those spontaneous contacts will not occur. And it's very easy when you engage on for sure, everyone will have a full-on agenda from morning to evening to jump from call to call, from conference to conference, and just completely miss those spontaneous interactions you would have before. You might not realize it on that moment, on that day, on that week, but the invoice for that will come sooner or later. And the only way for you to avoid that invoice, which for me is not a good invoice, is to counteract that deliberately. And that's what I call the intentionality on the contact, is to create deliberately those moments when you reach out to someone, not because you need to sort the problem or because you need some support or because you need to ask something, but just to create the small talk, just to create the interaction that otherwise you would have appearing just naturally. And that for me has proven to be a really, really important thing. I often say to more recently discussing with my leadership team around how are we tracking now, how do we compare with before, the whole return to the office versus working from home. And I was telling them at some point that I felt that we were less of a team. We were less of a team. And that showed when we met and how we interacted. And for me, the core reason was exactly that. People were still the same. Who we are, what defines us is still the same. We just did not have the context to spontaneously create those moments. So we need to literally work on those with an intention behind. And because of that, I would say probably the third one, if I kind of have to distill three, would be a really, really focus on, while recruiting, ensuring that from the get-go, you get as much as possible alignment between what you're getting and what you're looking for. And the reason being is exactly that. You will not be there every day. The amount of visibility that you will have to some potential discrepancies in terms of what you were expecting of that person versus what you're getting is smaller. Once again, you'll be focusing on outcomes, not on the way it's done. So the more likely you are from the beginning to ensure that those expectations are being met from the beginning, I would say the less likely it will be that later on you will have some missed expectations for both sides, right? Either from yourself as a manager or from as part of the team and from the person that joined the team. So I'd say probably those three as the core ones.
Yeah, gee, that's such an important point, that outsized investment that leaders can make in who they hire and making sure that they're a great fit. Because as you say, you're not going to be sitting with them all the time. No. So spending more time up front, even if it does feel like a time zap, is well worth it in the long term if you think about how you lead effectively in hybrid. Yeah, it's a fabulous, fabulous point. I'd love your thoughts, since obviously You're heavily involved with deep expertise in the university sector, and particularly with talent development. And from hearing from leaders all around the globe, they say that learning and development is an area that has been challenged over the last few years in how we do things. Can you share what you're seeing in terms of what's working for leaders to consider when they're thinking about uplifting the capabilities in their team?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I'm completely reiterate what you said, and this is not just by working on the university environment, but by managing a team and recruiting a few hundred people during a year. One of the things that we see is clearly more and more people valuing the opportunity to learn and develop on their future workplace. And that's actually something that from a Torrens perspective, so the university that I work for, that we've been trying to put more and more of focus and actually try to position that as one of the core pillars of our EVP. When you do that, then the question is, okay, how do you deliver that, right? And the type of expectation that I believe people currently have versus what they had in the past has also changed. What changed? I think, first of all, from a practical sense, the way you deliver that learning. Probably also the moving to work from home and all that has impacted that. But one of the things that we clearly see now is that people have a much bigger expectation that that learning also occurs on a flexible way. They expect to be able to learn when they want, not on the specific day that you set up the training, where they want, if possible, how they want. And that requires that when you conceive a program to develop specific types of skill sets, you first need to think, okay, how am I going to do that? And probably be mindful that the former one-size-fits-all solution of, we're going to schedule the training 9 to 5, we'll find some venue and we'll do that, for a good part of the current population might not be what they are looking for. They might be looking also for something online that they can do during the nights, during the breaks, during the weekends, and not have to go to a venue and spend 2 of their days there. So flexibility, definitely an important issue. The third thing probably is around the format itself. And obviously putting here my hat from a more formal context of the university and the learning, more and more, one of the things that we're seeing is people are at least talking about what we call working adults. So we're not talking about people leaving high school and going into universities. Working adults are more and more valuing the content of the learning itself and less the fact that it has a credential or that it's going to give you a master's title or a degree title, because more and more it's less relevant for them. What they want literally is to ensure that there's a specific skill, a specific set of knowledge that they want to acquire, that they want to master, and they want to get the fastest, more efficient way of getting there. And on these days, that might be doing a short course, it can be a micro credential, it can be a LinkedIn learning, and not wanting here to make any type of publicity, but any other formats that we have available. So I would say that as a L&D practitioner, when you look at the tools that you have available on your toolkit to get to the outcome that you're looking for, right now you have a much bigger variety of ways to getting there. And therefore, you also need to be very mindful of what are you trying to reach, for whom are you trying to do that, and therefore be very meticulous on the way that you choose the tool that you ultimately will use to get to that outcome.
Oh, that's so insightful, because I think, just as we were talking about before, that leaders need to evolve, and what worked when we were all in the office of how you lead, that needs to change. How to develop your people is another area that absolutely is ripe for the disruption, as you say, and it's happening right now. So for leaders to think through, okay, once again, what are those outcomes? What are the skills that you're wanting? And it may not have to happen in the more traditional forms that it has in the past. So absolutely. Yeah, it's fabulous insight. Fantastic. And shifting gears, what is the best, most practical advice you've been given to work smarter?
Um, Probably prioritize, just that, prioritize. And this is something that I was lucky enough to start studying from even a conceptual perspective from the beginning. At the time, I was a consultant and doing a lot of training on what we would call then soft skills, time management, inclusive. And one thing is to talk about practice, another one then is to feel the real need in real life, right? And as I started to get managerial roles, leadership roles, and the more that grew, the more it became evident to me, prioritize, differentiate clearly what is important and what is urgent. And the two do not mean the same by no means. Amount of time spent on a task does not equate proportionally to impact and outcomes. Understanding what is important, meaning what impact does it have? What value is this generating? And then being able to look at that from a how much time does this take to achieve perspective, that makes the whole difference. So that was by far the advice that most helped me move on my career.
Oh, I could not agree more with you. And I love so prioritization, absolutely. And it's interesting actually with my outcomes over our system, which is about being effective. So what you focus on, efficient, how you go about it, and energetic, the rocket fuel of looking after yourself. I always start with being effective. What makes sense? How do you prioritize what adds the most value? Because there is no point doing something super fast and efficiently if it's not the best stuff to work on in the first place. So I love that. I love also what you said that is a really great point I'd love to reinforce for people, where the amount of time that you spend on a task is not always the same in terms of the impact that you get out, and looking for those outsized proportional results that you can get for the same amount of time is really important. It's interesting, chatting with a leadership team in New Zealand this week, we were talking about for some of the people, doing 1 hour of yoga a week gave them the energy to be able to do their big jobs. And them saying, wow, 1 hour doing that versus an hour sitting in a meeting where I didn't need to be there, that 1 hour of yoga can absolutely be game-changing for the week in terms of how I work smarter. So I love that point that you make about what you do with your hours is not necessarily in proportion all the time.
Absolutely not. And one of the things that I personally realized as I've discussed this with teams, and especially people less comfortable with this type of topics, was how people felt difficult to differentiate, and often had the question, but how do you differentiate that, Hugo? How do I know if it is important or not? And what is, I always said, listen, ultimately you just feel it. And I'll give you two examples. Everyone for sure has had that period of day where you spent, I don't know how many hours on a row doing something. Probably you're tired at the end of the day, and you just take a moment to pause, deep breath, and think, what have I done so far? And you have this feeling, which is nothing that really matters. And automatically there's a sense of frustration, of lack of accomplishment. You just feel it. Probably what you've worked on the hours before, that was something that was not as important as what it could or should be. Likewise, for sure, all of us have had those days where, and just as for the extreme example, you start your day, you focus on something for 1 hour, 2 hours, half an hour, whatever. But when you finish that, you might even not had your mid-morning coffee, but you just have this feeling, which is, yes, I've made my day. I could almost close the day now and go home,
Yep.
and still have the feeling of, I made it worth. This is what's about. You feel it.
I love that. I love that so much. Well, Hugo, this has been amazing. I would love to wrap up with some rapid fire questions. Are you up for it?
For sure. Let's go for that.
Okay. What is the best purchase you've made for under about $100 over the past few years?
Ooh, $100. Okay. I'm not I'm not sure if it was the 100, so let's kind
That's
of
okay. That's okay.
round
Some
it,
have gone up
right?
to
Right?
250.
Yeah, okay, I'll round it. I think probably just slightly more than $100. I would say a pillow. I had some challenges sleeping. I realized that it was mostly due to not having a right pillow, and it was a complete game changer. I really got a pillow that was not just comfy, but it had these kind of a gel layer on top that just made it cool. I can tell it was day and night, literally day and night. So by far the most well spent $100 of the last years.
Yeah. Can you remember the brand?
I cannot, but I can for sure get back to you on that one.
Yeah, because sleep is one of those outsized things that we do in terms of the benefits that we get. So getting great quality sleep is one of the best things you can do to work smarter. So I love that answer. And what's the book that you have either gifted or recommended the most to other people?
Actually, I haven't given it for a while, but I've probably given dozens of these books. Very small book. I actually haven't heard a lot about it in Australia, but back in Europe, there was a lot of commotion at some point. The book is called Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. Have you read it?
Yep, love it.
Such a small, very quick read, but so powerful. That by far, I would say the book that I've given more and probably have recommended the most also.
It's a great one for leaders to think about change and adaptability. So particularly at the moment, if you think about what we've spoken about, it's a quick but a wonderful read. Fantastic. And what's the most fearless thing you've done in recent years?
Okay, I think that's an easy one. Just based on the feedback that I get. So my outside of work passion right now is spearfishing, which basically it's free diving. And in Australia, free diving often involves sharks. So by judging the reactions and feedback of wife and friends when I tell them that I went to dive and saw a bull shark or a tiger shark or whatever, and how stressed they are, I would say probably that's the thing at the point.
I've got goosebumps. Yeah, you take the cake on the most fearless thing by far. And finally, Hugo, to finish up, what does outcomes over hours mean to you?
I think it means a lot. It basically means it equates to productivity and ultimately doing the right thing. As we were chatting before we started recording, right? I am the living proof based on not just what I've seen, but also what I've experienced, that amount of time working does not directly proportionate to impact and productivity by no means. So being able to differentiate exactly those priorities, differentiate what matters more or less, and being able to make the right decisions and ultimately get to a point where you say no and no more. Because if I continue to stretch more, this ultimately will negatively impact me and come back to me in a way that I don't want. It's super important. So I would say the two clearly have a difference in the middle, and especially nowadays, being able to recognize that and see how does that apply to what you do, to your life, your professional life, your personal life also. It's super important.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, Hugo Contente, thank you so much for being my guest today on the Outcomes Over Hours show.
My pleasure, Tina. Thanks for inviting me.